Philosophers talk to our times. I was going to do Bergson today, but I'm actually going to do Durkheim because life's got complicated and I can do Durkheim easier. Technology and us. Durkheim exists at an age again where you have to remember what is just happening. That steam is being replaced, sails are being replaced by steamboats. And so for the first time really, possibly in all of human history, it's not just a few explorers with their guns sailing across the globe. It's everybody. It's not even just settlers. It's part-time colonialists, part-time administrators, academics. It meant that the way humans were organised suddenly became an issue. All the more so, as increasingly within Durkheim's life, throughout Europe, cities were growing, becoming more and more complicated, more and more socially diverse, dragging in different people from different parts of a country. But likewise, the concept of nationalism, which had been implicit since Napoleon, is growing its own power. You're getting towards the end of Durkheim's career, the beginning of Balkan nationalism and the valuing and the collecting of folk lore and dancing, of folk legends, that sort of ethnography that will found nations and eventually leads to the First World War. All of that is therefore buzzing around within Durkheim's world. The technology of steam trains, but also steam engines, is changing what a nation is, how it understands. There's a lovely bit of history, of course, that the steam train was what invented time for nations, and therefore time zones, because the train clock had to be the same in Glasgow as it was in Exeter, in spite of the fact that noon was at a slightly different time. So entire notions of temporalities that refer to timetables is being created. The world is hugely changing. How communication is being made through telegrams and the rest is on the move. All the more so then, that problem of how humans organise themselves comes hugely to the fore. How do humans organise themselves without all these telegrams? How do they instill themselves a concept of time, given that time was being instilled now by the steam train? More than that, when you went to our cultures as an academic, you might have expected to go and find an ancient Greece full of the heroes of the Iliad, but you didn't find that. You might have expected to find primitive savages eating each other, as they did in Robinson Crusoe, but you never found that. You might have expected to find hidden empires of the gods, and you sometimes found that. But what you did always find was ritual, social complexity, a deep fabric that appeared to have no easy foundations. There were no books of scripture, sometimes barely legend cycles. And yet folk were organising themselves. They were managing in societies, yes, that were small, and yes, that you could look down on as some sort of relic of your own sort of past, but that was surprisingly complicated. A complexity that, of course, needed explanation. All the more so on the back of imperial administration that would always seek to govern such societies. What it was that made society hold together then is becoming a very pressing problem. Caught up, of course, within the, I suppose one might use the phrase, the non-Marxist academics' response to Marx's challenge to the concept of nations. So there had to be a way of understanding nations that somehow made the national bit important. You will remember that this is beginning to be that time when there is a revolution in the way society is organised. Exactly when Marx says it would have been, except of course it's a nationalist revolution and not a socialist revolution. So understanding that nationalist revolution becomes critical as a way to augment it within a certain kind of academia. And Durkheim is fitting into that world. This is then the world of the social fact. The idea that societies, humanity, is held together not by formal organisations or even by laws, so much as social truths that are inculcated through ritual, through belief, but most important through ecstatic ceremony, into the minds of folk, so that they get drunk and sacrifice pigs and dance in the fire, and when they wake up, they have a social order, somehow there, caught up within their minds. On one level, from this perspective, we might think, what? But if you were Durkheim trying to explain, for instance, the complex world that you had seen, or heard of actually, because you didn't travel, but the complex world, for instance, of the cooler exchange ring in the Western Pacific, a set of exchanges that appeared to have no rhyme or reason, beyond very limited, usually semi-martial exchanges, and yet hooked together peoples all through the Pacific Basin. You had to have a theory as grandiose as those exchanges. And Durkheim's idea that there exists through some kind of collective consciousness. Collective consciousness? Yes, I think collective consciousness is the word he uses. Through which people in the context of wider society create between them social facts that are not reducible to any one individual, that are somehow independent from him. In his initial studies like suicide, he sees them in terms of social trends, statistical so middles. Sorry, I'm just suddenly worrying about this. Never mind, I'll come back to that another time. So he sees them as social middles, so that he could prove that the suicide rate was independent of individual actions, but was actually predictable. People killed themselves at times of great change, not at times of misery or times of joy. And so that while each individual life would be a tragedy, the overall statistic, that was a social fact. And then he flips it. He goes from things that were just created within kind of the dynamic of society, statistical. He moves quickly into the theory by elementary studies of religion, where actually the social facts are not just merely passive things that you can note as a good sociologist doing wide-scale statistical analysis. No, they become actually the patterning truths for society, where there doesn't appear to be law and order, where all the things that the West assumed had to be true about the world are gone. And then suddenly the rituals become the progenitors of social facts, the makers of men's minds, that which burned their truth into them. And the social facts become the gods. Creatures that, 3 generations later I suppose, Edmund Leach would say, actually people are worshipping as semi-divinities. Metaphysical reality then, that is conjured through ritual and creates society. Allows it to function and to exist, defines what men and what women are, captures conflict within a social network. It gave academia an entire means to understand a world that otherwise felt incomprehensible. In terms of the technology it was using, of course he was beginning to use, although Durkheim, bless him, doesn't have a lot of maths ability. I think that's fair to say. And certainly when he is starting doing his analysis in suicide, he's having to make up the statistics himself. So he's having to understand it from afresh. He doesn't have things like confidence intervals. He doesn't have the meta-analysis that maths developed the generation after him. But when it does develop these kind of meta-analyses become terribly easy and straightforward to do. So that you can define a society through its big pictures. You can define a society through how it is creating its social facts, which you can see as statistical realities. Statistical realities, then, that will somehow pattern minds that flip and become causal, as a way of explaining how law is created without law. Without the steam engine, without the steamboat, such a world would not be necessary. Previous generations didn't need it. Kant could simply say that people who weren't logical were somehow always a bit embarrassed about it. He knew of their existence, but he kind of blamed them for being different. Durkheim, faced with a world where actually the Western imperial powers had to administer all these states they barely understood, had to find an affinity with them, a way to coalesce with them. And that is, of course, precisely what the social fact is. It's how to find a single truth that unites passively a Western society, but actively non-Western societies. That allows you to think where order comes from, and why religion is so dominant. That opens the gates to anthropology, as much as it opens the gates to sociology. Marcel Mauss was something like Durkheim's son-in-law, so the first French anthropologist. All of that, then, on the back of the steamboat that took people places they didn't dream of, opened up a world they could not even think of. A mind made through travel. A minds that were defined in terms of laws that could never be seen or spoken, but that somehow bound us all together, that explained nationalism in the Balkans or the cooler exchange in the Pacific. It's a great philosophical idea, as global as the world would become global. And would fracture, ultimately, in the face of the First World War, as the technologies that actually linked the world together would break it. And Durkheim's rather rosy view, where he sees the West as organising differently to all the rest, would founder in the mud of Flanders.